It was right.
Okay,
Over
so
to you, Andy.
thank
Oh,
you.
do you need to share screen? So
Yes, if I can, thanks. So I'm pressing the button.
is it working?
It's working, but I've got that many documents open. Can't even tell. Here we go. Everybody seeing that?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So the thing is, here you've been provided with a bunch of resources, and some of them overlap quite a bit, but hopefully they'll all be useful for you to digest. This is not there's no expectation that you should have read these before this evening, and there's no expectation that you're going to absorb all of this in a short space of time. So take your time. You've got those in your hands. You can look at them whenever you want, and we'll talk about some of them this evening, but I'm not going to go through every single document. You're probably very relieved to hear that. So this is a set of documents which reinforces the information from last week, which was about whether you need to become a registered provider and some of the potential alternatives working in partnership with existing registered providers. So I thought probably the best place to start off is this sheet here, which is a relatively short summary of the pros and cons of becoming a registered provider. So does it give a quick shout out? Has anybody managed to skim through this at all already?
A little bit. It's just a quick skim.
Yeah, no worries. Okay. Well, the obvious point is that if community-led organisations were able to access government housing grant without becoming a registered provider, I should think they'd probably be very happy to do so. But we can't do that. So really, the primary driver for becoming a registered provider is in order to get our hands on capital grant. And we all know that it's very difficult to get schemes to stack up in terms of costs and viability. And so capital grant is usually absolutely fundamental to creating affordability in any particular project. So it's obviously that's the main driver, but we know from last week that the question then is whether or not to become a registered provider yourselves, or whether to actually avoid that by working with an existing registered provider. And that option didn't used to exist. It's something which is gradually consolidated over the last decade or so, and it's definitely an option worth considering. So we'll just run through the points here on the sheet. So there's the grant, and there's the question of control. Some community groups start out with the idea that they're going to do everything themselves, and it's because for whatever reasons they feel that they need to be able to have clarity about what's going to happen, and they want to have control over what happens. But as you go through the process, you might decide that the idea of working in a partnership with a much reduced workload might be attractive. And for some groups, they are very focused on the idea of self-delivering and having that control and managing that workload, whereas other groups are very interested in the possibility of working in partnership. So the other issue is one which is sort of touched on in the questions which Rachel and I have circulated over the past few days. And that's about what your long-term aspirations are. So maybe if you were just going to do one small scheme, becoming a registered provider might not be that important to you, although it might equally be very important to you. But if you're thinking about the long term, doing several schemes and actually becoming a strategic player, like for instance, Keswick have now done 4 or 5 schemes and built nearly 50 houses. And that was always their intention. So from their point of view, or an organisation like Keswick, that's Keswick Community Housing Trust, that could be an angle for you, that you're actually wanting to actually deliver many more schemes into the future, and that makes it worthwhile going through the RP process. In terms of financial advantages, there's the stamp duty advantage, so that can be very worthwhile. But if you're working in a partnership, your partner will have that advantage anyway. So that means that that aspect isn't lost. This business next, competing to provide affordable homes on 106 sites. So in other words, where a developer has an obligation to provide a certain number of affordable homes, then as a registered provider and a community-led housing group, you would be able to compete with other housing associations to provide those homes. It's not something which happens very often, not least because the competitive process, it's not really ideal even for big housing associations, because they're actually all spending public money, and being put into a competitive context like that means that they might end up they do end up competing against each other, which actually increases the amount of public funding which may need to go into a project in one way or another. And also from a communities organizer point of view, you probably, it's going to be more significant if you're turned down, having put in a lot of effort into submitting a bid, whereas a housing association can shrug that off because they're doing it fairly regularly. You may appear more credible to lenders as a registered provider. That gives you the credibility of having gone through a process which has been approved by a government agency. The regulation will help your organisation to be well run. So there are quite detailed governance requirements and financial viability requirements. So what is to some extent a kind of an extra set of hoops which you're required to jump through. On the other hand, the hoops that you are asked to jump through are really only concerning the sorts of requirements which any well-run organisation ought to take seriously. So in that sense, they probably aren't onerous or extra, but they're just making sure that all the boxes are ticked. Yes, the assured tenancies, usually that's the aim of a community-led organisation, which is all about perpetuity and reliability of tenure. This is quite an interesting one. The fact that to be a community land trust, for instance, you have to have an asset lock in place very often in order for funders to be able to provide funding. So you have to set something up in the early stages of the process. So you've probably got an asset lock already if you've got as far as incorporating, and that can potentially conflict with becoming a registered provider, because that confers an asset lock as well. So the CLT network has got some guidance on that, and there are ways around it. It's a bit of a faff, but if you haven't incorporated, then you can actually be aware of that before it happens. But that's one of the reasons why it's important to get specialist legal advice from the firms of solicitors which the community-led housing movement tends to work with. So you've got the yourselves and your tenants will have recourse to the Housing Ombudsman Scheme, and potentially other housing associations, registered providers, may be able to transfer homes to your organisation. And then if we look at issues which might be disadvantages, by the way, just shout out if you do have any questions or observations. So it may be that you have a particular model of housing in mind, and becoming a registered provider might in some way inhibit that vision of yours. I can't think of any examples off the top of my head, but it is a factor which other organisations have mentioned. Your organisation might want to do something like mutual home ownership, and you can't get housing grant for that at the moment. You could in the last community housing fund, which was a specialist fund administered by Homes England, but at the moment, since that's expired, we're back to the tenures which Homes England supports, which is affordable rent, social rent, or shared ownership. And obviously, becoming a registered provider, as we saw last week, that is only required if you're intending to own and acquire housing grant for either affordable rented or social rented homes. So if you happen to be doing a scheme which was entirely shared ownership, then you wouldn't need to become a registered provider. It may be that you're not comfortable with the idea of being regulated by an outside organisation. I'm just trying to see if I can change this so I can see my own writing in full. Here we go. Is that still okay for you? Yeah. The time required to become registered is an issue that you need to think about. You only need to be registered at the time when the homes are ready to be occupied. But the regulator talks about the preliminary application. I think they turned that round in 15 days, if I remember. It's in some of the other guidance. But and then 6 months for the detailed application. But in practice, it usually takes a lot longer than that. They have all sorts of questions. And you've got to convince them of all sorts of different things. So you need to bear in mind that if you've got a project underway and you're going to become a registered provider, there's a degree of synchronization that needs to take place. It's just something to be aware of. Yeah. And as we know, it's potentially possible to sidestep the question of becoming a registered provider if you can manage to set up a partnership with a housing association. So we've got the administrative burden that will increase. There's a degree of reporting required, but in practice, the regime is lighter for small registered providers, which means less than 1,000 homes. There's an annual fee for small registered providers.
We lost Andy.
Those sorts of issues.
Oh, Andy, we lost you for a bit then. Well, I did. Did anybody else?
Hear you.
Okay, good, great. Obviously, the regulator, being a regulator, has got powers to intervene if the organisation is failing in some way. That's really a good thing because it might be able to help you Certainly, it would be good from the tenant's point of view. Rent levels obviously would be subject to policy emerging from the government and Homes England. But again, it's if you're able to develop a project without housing grant, then you can have your own policies on rent levels. But if you're the price that you pay for having the advantage of grant is that you're then in the same regime as housing associations and subject to government policy. And things can pop up out unexpectedly. They always do. So, for instance, if you go back 4 or 5 years, the government decided it was a great thing to ask housing or tell housing associations to reduce their rents by 1% a year, which caused a bit of panic amongst community land trusts. But eventually, the CLT network was able to win an exemption. There's other examples, the bedroom tax, what policies might emerge in terms of right to buy. But at the moment, the rent reduction and the right to buy CLTs are exempt from those. The bedroom tax is something which would affect you. And allocation rights, depending on the attitude of your local authority, a local authority would normally be able to allocate a certain percentage of allocations to a housing association scheme. And they may try to do the same with your project. But what would hopefully happen would be that if they did insist on that, their aims would be the same as yours in terms of prioritizing local people. So that shouldn't be too much of a problem. And then lastly, applying for grant, you have to go through the information management system, Homes England, which can be a little bit complicated, but you can get help from housing associations to do that. So that shouldn't be too much of an obstacle. So is there anything that you'd like to go back to that's covered in this bit of guidance? Any questions that arise from any of that? Things that you might be concerned about, or things that you think are need to be clarified at all?
Andy, for me, I think that the main concern from that is around the government policy effects. I mean, is Section 106, what's the future of that look like? And it's just to be a bit nervous, I think, for the whim of whatever government decides.
Yeah, well, I think the answer to that really is that whatever you do, there are going to be risks. And then it's just a question of hopefully identifying what those risks are and how likely they are, and whether or not there's an alternative way around it. And if there is an alternative way, then that's fantastic. We might be able to actually steer in a different direction. But the problem is affordability, really. If you're not trying to do a scheme which is affordable, life is much more straightforward. But life is more straightforward for people who can pay the full cost of housing anyway. So the challenge is how we can get results for people who need affordability. And usually we can't manage that without government grant. So there is a degree of risk in terms of future government policy, but there's no way that we can guess what that might be. And the risks which have emerged, we've managed to actually more or less do something about those, which I suppose is a good precedent. And Section 106 sites, I don't think that's necessarily completely out of reach of community organisations, but I think it would probably work better if you can get in early in discussions with developers and local authorities. with a kind of a flexible approach, you know, because if you think about it, the bulk of housing is actually delivered by developers. So that's where the main land supply is. And so that's where the main supply of affordable housing is. And so if you know, therefore, if we can get in on that supply, we might be able to deliver bigger schemes or more schemes, or at least it's another source of sites and so on. So if you can get into discussions with local authorities early on and say, look, don't forget us when you're talking to developers, and housing associations. So the more conversations you can have with housing associations, with the local authority, when they start to sit down with developers, they can start to say, well, actually, you know, we would like to do something a little bit different here. And it might be that they can do it for you, or it might be that it can be opening a door that you would find difficult to open otherwise.
I'm not altogether, if I may just ask a question, I'm not altogether clear about the section 106. Are you suggesting that if a developer had an off-site commitment to produce some, to provide some affordable housing, we could step in and do that for them? And if that was the case, would they then provide the money rather than us having to get another grant?
Well, so it might be off-site, but not necessarily. I think in the majority of cases, the local authority is trying to avoid the affordable housing being provided somewhere else. They're trying to get it where the development happens. So it could be either off-site, or it could be, it's essentially opportunistic. So it's driven by the discussions that are happening between the developer and the local authority. So either of those scenarios might be possible. And the thing about developer-driven affordable housing is the housing associations don't get grants. It's supposed to be grant-free. But what that means is it might be possible for a housing association or the local authority to say, look, instead of inviting a competitive tender from housing associations, we'd like you not to do this. And to actually talk to such and such community group instead, and see whether or not we can get whether or not they can actually provide those homes that you've got to provide. And the way and the model itself is simpler than developing independently, because the developer will build the homes and then sell them to you. So it's taken out the development risk.
In progress.
It's something which is worth bearing in mind. We probably need to kind of have a chat about the pros and cons and the ins and outs of this outside of this meeting, but it's certainly an avenue worth considering or being aware of.
Yeah, thank you.
Are you happy for me to move on to the other paper that I was going to run through? Yeah? If
Yes.
I can find it, I'll see if I can find it. Got it. Okay, so would you find it useful to go through in a little bit more detail the development options which I covered last week? So in other words, just looking a little bit more at the pros and cons of self-developing compared to the other two options, which would be in partnership with housing associations. That's okay to do? Good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Let's do that then.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I won't kind of read out the every single paragraph. Let's cut straight to the first option here, self-delivery.
Yeah, I'm still seeing the other document. Is everybody else?
Let me close that then.
Yeah, still the first one.
Are you seeing that now?
Yeah, it still hasn't gone.
Hasn't gone. I've just closed it actually.
Now it's just smaller. Now you're scrolling.
Okay, I'm going to get rid of that and reopen. Bear with me. Just
Gone now. Maggie, sorry about that. My hosting duties had been removed. It took me all that time to realise why I couldn't let you in. I couldn't see the waiting room.
Well, I suppose you've added to my experiences of today, I suppose.
I had to call Tom from another meeting to come back because it's on his account.
I think this is number 7 of 9 webinars I've been on today, so I am somewhat zoomed out. But I'd just like to, my last one was with the Allianz, as I call them, the business school. So they've updated me on the income and I can expect as a CEO in the UK.
Oh,
An
right,
average
that'd be
of
interesting.
£900 per hour.
Right, Andy, have you found your other document?
Yeah, it looks like it. I'll do a screen share. Is
Yeah, let's screen share it and then,
that working?
yeah, it's just a bit wee.
Okay, let me see if I can fix that too. That's probably too big now, isn't it?
No, that's okay for me. Is it all right for everyone else? Yeah, it's still quite small. We'll just go like this.
Hang on, I'm just going to try and tune back into the right document. Are we there?
Yeah.
Sorry. I'm just going to try and shrink that down a bit.
What's that noise? Is it Maggie?
Should we try that?
I've changed my view now, so you're all little over there, so I can see it. Can you see it, Martin and Bob and Sophia? Right,
Yeah.
let's go.
It's a
Okay.
double page, isn't it? Double
Yes, I can. I can see.
I'm just trying to get single page working, which is, it doesn't seem to want to. And I can't get it to scroll either.
On 100% again. Oh my Lord, what's going on?
Can you see anything?
Yeah, we can see, I can
Yeah,
see
you
2
can see.
pages.
Is it too small?
Not for me.
No, I can squint.
Okay, well, if that's acceptable, we'll just run through it as it
Yeah.
is. So self-delivery, and there's a few links to examples for each of these within the document. So this is about taking full responsibility for planning and funding and project managing the project, maximum control and ownership with a large workload and full responsibility for risk and so on, but with the potential for the rewards of the scheme being as you wanted it to be, by taking on that responsibility. So just a quick look at the advantages. So you've got control over the project. You can augment the skills and capacity of your board by buying in professional support. The other thing which is sometimes a driver for organizations is that because it's your project and you own it, you have the benefit of the long-term surpluses that are created once the loans associated with the project are repaid. So that would provide, depending on the size of the scheme, quite substantial reinvestment income. So you could either invest that in more projects or activities which are compatible with your rules or memonarts and so on for the benefit of the community. And by running something yourselves, there's an opportunity there for you to actually gain new skills and be able to end up with an organization which can do things which didn't exist before. So the disadvantages, obviously it's the risk and responsibility aspect, but it's surprising how many organizations around the country have actually taken up the challenge of doing this and made a fantastic success of it. It's definitely, with the right support, it's definitely possible. It's going to entail a significant workload over a number of years. Just as an example, just because I happen to know about it, Keswick Community Housing Trust, they went from sitting around a table wondering whether or not they might be able to do something to having people living in finished houses in 4 years. And I mean, a housing association would be doing well to be able to do a project in that sort of time. And that's an already set up organization that knows what it's doing. So, you know, it may take more than 4 years, but it is possible. But that's the kind of thing to bear in mind, the timescales. So you need to have the confidence that within your team, you've got the right skills around the table if you're thinking of taking the project on yourselves. So that might affect your recruiting policy. You might actually look for specific skills to bring into the board. Although, you know, there have been community groups that, for instance, they didn't have project managers in their ranks, so they haven't gone down one of the other partnership routes, but they have brought in project management from a housing association, just to take care of that aspect. But ultimately, the group itself is responsible. So even when you're buying in project management, all the finance and all the decision making, the group needs to understand that's their responsibility. And of course, if you want grant and there's affordable rents, then you've got to become a registered provider. So then looking at the development lease, which you might remember from last week, this has been developed in order to hugely simplify the process for community groups. So what it focuses on is the acquisition of a piece of land. And that then means that the community group can lease that land to a partner of its choice. And then that development partner will take on all the workload and all the development risk, sort out all the finances and manage the finished homes. But it will also keep the surpluses, rent surpluses, as the loans are paid down, because it's taking the risk and responsibility. So the focus of attention for the community group on this particular model it is really concentrated on the legal agreement between itself and its partner. And so you do need a little bit of funding in order to pay for specialist legal advice so that you get the very best out of that agreement. And the way that you would set the scene for selecting a partner would be to put together a prospectus, which you can then circulate to a number of organizations, and that will spark initially informal conversations and then hopefully expressions of interest and then formal selection through interviews. So by producing a prospectus, you're actually helping those organizations to understand what you're trying to do, showing them that you're already well organized, and providing some context in terms of case studies and so on. So the emphasis is really on this business of negotiating the heads of terms, and then after that, the lease itself. And hopefully, if that's done well, you would actually achieve most of your aims through this development lease mechanism without having to actually take on the risk and responsibility. So,
And is that what the community group would benefit from? Is that what they get out of the lease? They get their aims and objectives met. They don't get any financial gain, or can they borrow based on the land, or is that only the housing association can do that?
That's a good question, and the answer is that as I was just going through that because of the responsibility which is being taken on by the housing association, it's taking out the loans and it's managing the project. It would then, because it's a long lease, it would be able to borrow against the scheme. So to all intents and purposes, it's pretty much got all the same kinds of outcomes as it would have if it was just developing a scheme itself in the normal way. But the difference is that it's actually tuning the scheme to your requirements as a community group, and it's voluntarily entering into a lease agreement which achieves that. And so it does keep the rental income, which will eventually produce surpluses. And in terms of financial income, the only thing that the community group gets out of this is a modest ground rent sufficient to cover its annual administrative costs. So, you know, it's horses for courses. You know, if you're feeling really gung-ho and you've got the time, you can do self-development. But if you're saying, well, you know, we are going to actually go all out to get certain aims and objectives delivered, but it's not appropriate for us to actually become developers, then this is a good option. And that's what Pride of Place in Leeds have been doing, so that they're just setting out on that journey. So with this one, the advantage is it's a tested model of delivery. No need to become either an investment partner or a registered provider. Working with an experienced partner, reduced workload. Disadvantages, if you see them that way.
Can you move the documents on? Because I can only still see one.
If it lets me.
Oh, yeah.
It's not letting me drag it across, unfortunately. I don't know why.
Okay, don't worry.
Sorry. Hopefully, if I just read through it, that might cover it. Potential disadvantages, compromise on project specifications is likely to be required, but you could read that another way. You could think that the housing association, because it's an experienced and expert developer, is actually, by modifying the specifications for the project, is actually ensuring its success. You know, so that's not necessarily a disadvantage, I suppose. There could be some constraints on the allocation policy. In some scenarios, the local authority and the housing association are keen for the community organisation to come up with its own template for the allocations policy. And they all agree this together. In other situations, the housing association and the local authority have got more specific views about what they want to get out of it. So that is a process of negotiation and compromise. Finding a willing housing association to be your partner, it may be difficult, but I think the better that you present yourselves, the more likely organisations are going to be in talking to you. So I think that's where it comes back to this prospectus, a well-presented prospectus. And then the third model, which is the consortium model. And this is where there are two variations on this. One is that the housing association can apply for the grant on your behalf. The outcome from this particular model is that you end up owning and managing the houses. But this is just something which can either take care of the grant application process, or it can do that and the development. And if you stop and think about it, what you're looking for is trying to sort of ease the development process. If you're going to have to handle the development process, then having a housing association get the grant is nice, but it's not really going to deal with the fact that you're going to be doing development for the first time. So in that sense, why not go the whole hog and actually enter into a partnership where the housing association is going to not only get the grant, but also handle the whole development and then hand it over to you once it's built. And then you haven't had to dip your toes in the development process, and you get a safely delivered project, which you can either, as you're going to own rented homes, you're going to need to be a registered provider, but you still have the option of either then managing the homes yourselves or contracting that out to a housing association. So this is where this scenario means that you're going to own the project, but the risk associated with development is handled by a housing association partner. So just looking quickly at those advantages, an experienced partner, minimal workload during development, more control over the scheme because it is going to be your scheme as opposed to the development lease, which is much more ownership orientated towards the housing association. And you've got the option of contracting out the housing management. Disadvantages, compromise may be needed because if the housing association is handling the development, it may have views about costs and so on and so forth. Finding a willing housing association partner. And for this particular model, I've found it, examples are relatively thin on the ground, but I have spoken to housing associations, one in London recently, who said that they'd actually done this on a regular basis for community organisations. And it had been quite a significant strand of their operations. And they did it at cost in order to help organisations that had similar objectives to their own. But they weren't doing it at present. So, there may be housing associations which have done this in the past and aren't doing it now, or there may be others that haven't done it in the past who are quite interested in looking at that possibility. So depending on how the housing association looks at it, they might see it as being, more trouble than it's worth, or they might see it as being part of their social mission and something which they are quite happy doing. The fourth option on this bit of guidance is really flagging up an option which doesn't include affordable housing. I don't know whether you've come across Marmalade Lane at all. It's a co-housing project, and the model there is based around a group of 40 families who did not need affordable housing, but they wanted a safe route to getting a development, and they partnered up with a developer, and he brought on board a constructor, and the developer and the constructor handled all the development, and the families were signed up to be the customers. So they kind of de-risked the scheme in terms of the developer and the constructor knew that they had ready-made sales before they started. So it's quite good for both parties' point of view, but there was no affordable housing in this particular. So it's rather like swapping a housing association for a commercial developer, where there's a scheme that doesn't involve any affordable housing. And then there's various links to examples for each of those categories of partnership. The other thing to quickly finish on is just that if you're depending on which of these options you're attracted to, whether it's self-delivery, the development lease, or the consortium, each one of those is going to have a very different set of actions. So the action plan, the steps, the sequence for each of those variations will be quite different. So if you're self-developing, you're going to have to get into the whole business of analyzing sites, testing viability, lining up funding, lining up finance, tendering for the build contracts, and so on. If you're going down the development lease route, then the housing association is obviously going to do all that for you. And equally with the consortium model, the housing association can do that either for you or in partnership with you for the project which you're going to end up owning. So I feel as if I've been talking rather a lot this evening, but one thing to say is that you're all welcome to come back to me on the phone anytime if you want to talk any of this through. But shall we field any questions or thoughts that have come up just running through this?
Andy, if I may, we are thinking of partnering with another CLT who is a registered provider in order to get the scheme built out, and then hopefully we'll become an RP ourselves, and we want to be able to take the properties back into our own ownership and our own control in due course. Is that something which happens frequently or not?
That's the first time I've heard of it.
Right.
So, but that's typical community-led housing. That there are each project is unique and to a certain extent. So I'm not quite sure. I think that to me might be a good one for legal advice potentially, unless you've already looked into it.
No, we haven't. We've only just talked very briefly, really, with this other CLT. They seem, fairly keen on it, but their immediate reaction was, right, we have to see what the lawyers say about this, and whether or not there'd be any problems with it. But no,
Yeah.
I was hoping you're going to turn around and say, oh yeah, that's fairly common, and would tell me how to do it.
Yeah.
But,
No, well, my first thought is yes, I would pick up the phone to some solicitors and see what they have.
Yeah. Yeah, okay.
I'd be quite interested to hear, if possible, what the advice is that you receive. It'd be interesting.
Yes, okay, well, I can make that known, certainly, yeah. Okay, thank you.
And it's a couple of things in one of the documents you mentioned, as well as the housing association becoming a registered provider partner agreement. They also need to be an investment partner. Is that just part of the agreement, lease agreement, or is there something you need to set up specifically with an investment partner?
That's a good point, which is touched on in some of the other guidance that you had by email. So the investment partner is something which you have to become. It's with Homes England, and the registered provider is with the regulator of social housing. So in order to get a grant, you have to become an investment partner, and in order to own and manage rented homes, you have to become a registered provider.
Right.
So two different things with two different organizations.
Okay.
Last time I went through it, the investment partner process wasn't very difficult.
And I might be a bit thick, but the GM's hub, if they would become the registered provider, would that be looking at the consortium model for us smaller community groups? Is that the approach we would take?
Yeah, well, I think this is something where it'd be very good for you to sort of, if you get to the point where you feel as if you've got a good grip on these options, you know, whether it's the development lease. I mean, just to run through, it could be the development lease, the consortium model, or it could be project management from the hub, if you wanted to actually own the project yourselves. So it depends on what the hub is able to provide in terms of capacity. The hub would need to have for the consortium model, or helping you with project management for a self-delivery scheme, the hub would have to have in-house development expertise, project management expertise. So it depends whether that is the aim of the hub in the long term. But in the short term, I think the hub will be thinking in terms of, because obviously it's going to take a while for the hub to actually become a registered provider. So there's a kind of a stepping stone into that, where the hub could play a role in helping to encourage housing associations to talk to you about potential partnerships.
Mm. Brilliant. And that leads us into the forum meetings, which is great.
Right.
Yeah, I think that the hub needs to, with the steering group, need to think about exactly what their offer is as regards registered provider, don't they? So I think at the moment we're stuck in a bit of a looking for a potential partner and then seeing what they come forward with and then what we can offer. So we're kind of just in no man's land at the moment. You know, maybe that's something you and Tom need to discuss, Bob, and it might actually come out with a plan. Because your project probably isn't immediate either, is it?
Yeah, no, it's not. So, I mean, this has been fantastic. It's been really good because it's really, you know, foundation stuff, thinking about the, you know, where we want to go and our vision, and then developing a prospectus and approaching people. So it's great stuff, and it's brilliant.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm glad it seems useful. As I say, you know, we can just keep on having conversations about this as required, you know. It's quite a lot for groups to get their heads round, but at the same time, it's essential stuff, and you know, you will gradually become kind of familiarized with it, and hopefully it will help you to make the right choices for your organization.
Yeah. And can I just ask one last thing about, because you mentioned as well about community groups becoming constituted. If there's a charity already existing, I guess this is something the charity needs to get advice about whether they take on the risk or they create a separate entity that will do the housing element.
Yes, absolutely. This is not uncommon, actually. So we're looking at one in the Bradford area at the moment. So there's an existing charity which is doing it's doing family support around homework and out of school activities, and it's also doing community catering, different things. But they've decided to actually get involved in housing to try to sort of, you know, complement what they're doing in other fields, and they're actually quite keen to self develop. So they've been taking legal advice about whether or not to do it through the housing development through the existing charity, and they've come up with a model which is going to be to actually have two separate organizations. There's going to be a new company which is going to handle the housing, but it's going to have directors from the charity on the new company board, so that the two can actually talk to each other and work together. And again, every situation will be different. In some situations, it's going to be best for the existing organization to take on board housing, because obviously the less organizations you have, the easier it is to run, and the less admin there is. But there can be strong legal reasons for having, you know, a subsidiary or a new organization. So that's where the legal advice is very important.
Look at last week, and we had the Broughton Trust and Inspiring Communities together, didn't we? And they both set up separate new entities as companies limited by guarantee to take the housing forward. So that's obviously the route they've gone down as locally based charities, and it's also allowed them to take out the local geographic restrictions. So they both work in a very small area of Salford as a charity, but when they've set up the company limited by guarantee, they've taken out those geographic restrictions, which means that they could, in theory, in the future, do community-led housing, affordable homes in other places.
Clever,
yeah. And we've actually got some guidance on company incorporation as well. You know, because there can be all sorts of different drivers for what you end up choosing in terms of company model.
Mm-hmm.
You know, for instance, if you going back to Keswick, they decided to become a community benefit society because they wanted to do a share issue. So that immediately points in the direction of one particular type of company, and they actually raised half the cost of buying their first piece of land through a community share issue.
Wow.
But they're also quite clever because they became what's known as an exempt charity, which is not registered with the Charity Commission. It's registered with HMRC, but it has the same effect, and that provides other benefits as well, which they felt were important. I mean, for instance, one of them was that they were buying the land off the diocese, and it was easier for the diocese to make that piece of land available if it was dealing charity to charity. So they came up with a very clever type of incorporation, which partly came from the charity world and partly came from the cooperative world. Yeah. But we should I mean, that's one of the things which new groups need to go through, really, is to kind of look at the different types of companies that are available, which is so that when they start to talk to solicitors, they're already a little bit tuned in.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's one of the first things we need to think about as well, as well as getting the perspectives together, is who's actually approaching organizations, charities. Is it the charity itself, or is it a subsidiary or whatever? So we need to think about that.
I mean,
Might be worth talking to Dave at or Bernadette. You know, Dave at Broughton or Bernadette at Inspiring Housing, and asking them sort of what they went through.
Yeah, they were great last time, weren't they?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
What we've been doing over at Leeds Community Homes is we've been doing a kind of a set body of work with new groups, which is about a range of topics. So it's about vision, it's about governance, it's about technical understanding, and that includes incorporation. So we would do a workshop on incorporation, and then we would then advise groups to go to, if they've got funding, to go and choose a firm of solicitors. In fact, you know, ask for quotes from a limited number of firms that we deal with. But whilst there is a certain amount of technical considerations to bear in mind, what we try to do is to actually have a non-technical vision, which is really making it very clear what the aims of the organization are. So it's like, we're trying to do this. What's the best type of company that will enable us to do that? Let the solicitors do the clever stuff. You know, so you describe the vision, you describe your circumstances, you know, like whether you are or you aren't incorporated and so on, and then let them provide the advice. You know, and the advice will, you know, it might be a little bit ambiguous sometimes. So you still have to kind of, at the end of the day, you have to make your own choice subject to that advice.
Brilliant. Excellent stuff.
It's just like a personal thing now, Bob. There's just you here.
I know, gosh, it's very cheap, and that could.
Well, the questions are great because they're relevant to you know, all the groups. So the conversation we're having here is still, you know, because we're recording and so on. It's hopefully it'll spark thoughts off in the minds of the other groups that might get to see the recording.
Yeah,
Because a lot of our groups are, I mean, yeah, we're covering lots of different elements, and which Andy and I are always chatting about and saying how they're all interlinked, you know, so that, yeah, your legal structure, your finance, your registered provider, everything is linked. There's a lot of these decisions that need to be made way before you kind of, do anything about maybe getting a site or whatever. So, and often people jump ahead with that, don't they? Because an opportunity comes up. I mean, a bit like with the LGBT Foundation, the opportunity came up with Manchester, but the consultation's done, which is great. So you know what your vision is, but the mechanics still need a lot of working on, don't they?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I think it would be quite good if we, like I said in the email today, Rachel, it might be good if we had a sort of a checklist of things that we would recommend a new group went through, because it's all about kind of providing a really good foundation for moving on to development. So
Great.
Yeah, we need to chat just a bit more.
do you think that we've reached a conclusion for this evening, or are there other things that we should talk about?
I think that's probably fine. I mean, Bob, you've got another thing at 20 past anyway.
Yeah, no,
We're in
that's-
touch quite a lot. Bob's coming to the forum which is 2 weeks, I think. He's going to give her sort of a bit of feedback about the training, and then at the forum, that's the chance where we're asking people if there's more training that they'd want on this issue or on other issues. So I think, as Bob says, it leads well onto there, and I need to have a look at all the resources as well, because I just haven't had a chance to do them this week after coming back from holiday, Andy. So if there's any questions on those, we could just ask in the email group or whatever.
Yeah.
If that's all right with you, Andy?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, and I'll send the video out now. I know how to. Now I've got a YouTube channel. You see, I'm all high tech now.
Oh, happy days.
So, okay, that was really
Thank you.
good.
Thanks a million, Andy. It's been brilliant. Really good.
Well,
Till
good,
soon.
good
Thanks.
good questions, Bob. Thanks for the questions.
Always got good questions.
Oh, it's been fascinating. Really, really good. Can't wait to see where it goes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks a million.
Okay, right. I'll end it. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.